The setting is a world completely different from the one we know. 100 years ago, a ray of light descended upon the Earth and consumed it entirely, transforming the blue planet into an endless desert. What little remained of humanity clung to life by building their own fortresses, islands of survival in the middle of an ocean of sand. And it was in this merciless world that Xeon was born, a simple peasant surrounded by all manner of wretched and violent people. But Xeon was not the type to bow his head to anyone. When a man tried to steal his belongings, the confrontation ended in a way he never expected. The thief ended up dead. It was not intentional, but the outcome was the same. The problem was that the dead man had ties to Liang, unawakened, and in the post-apocalyptic world, the awakened were treated as deities. The victim's associates showed up shortly after, and unlike what Xeon expected, the man didn't even feel the impact of the punch he took. He simply tossed the boy aside like a rag, coldly demonstrating the powers of an awakened to teach the bold young man a lesson. It was at that moment that an accident changed the course of everything. The vehicle flipped over, injuring the driver, and before succumbing, the driver managed to murmur that something enormous was approaching from beneath the sand. What emerged from that sandy surface was a creature of monstrous proportions, a sandworm the size of an entire building. Xeon knew there was no way to escape. He was weak, without powers, without resources, and then he was swallowed by the beast. But death did not come. Waking up alive inside the belly of a creature of that size was something no logic could explain. But it was precisely there, in the depths of that visceral darkness, that something inside Xeon broke, or perhaps awakened. Memories of the destroyed planet flooded his mind like a torrent, and it was in that instant that he activated his ability for the first time: explosive sand. The blast tore through the creature's body from the inside out, and Xeon emerged alive, transformed. He felt every beat of his own heart as he had never felt before. A different energy circulated through his body. It was the awakening, and he knew it. He barely had time to process what had happened when a man appeared out of nowhere, interrupting the advance of a second sandworm that was already moving to devour him. The man threw Xeon aside with a single motion, spitting sand while questioning how on earth that boy had appeared out of nowhere. But his attention turned back to the monster in the same instant, because what he did next was something that made Xeon freeze in astonishment. The man drove a blade into the sandworm's neck with absurd precision, sending black blood pouring out like pitch. He then delivered a devastating kick against the sword embedded in the creature, driving it in until the monster stopped moving forever. A single strike to end it all. A young woman with blue hair approached Xeon shortly after, introducing the man as Captain Yongbyung, and already making it clear that showmanship was his natural state. Before the boy could say a word, the girl had already overpowered him and pinned him to the ground with disconcerting ease. She tried to identify his rank and abilities in a playful manner, but what she found left her intrigued. Xeon had no visible rank insignia. She confirmed this to Captain Yongbyung, who until then had been watching the scene with a certain disinterest. Xeon himself was confused. Every awakened had a mark. Insignias carried information. Blue indicated magical affinity. Red pointed to fighters, but no record spoke of anyone with dominion over sand itself. On Youngbaum's instruction, he ended up being taken along with the team, tossed in the back of the vehicle like luggage and still tied up. The captain's team was not exactly the most civilized group. While chaos reigned around him, Xeon realized he could manipulate the sand, drifting into the vehicle with no effort at all. The confirmation was definitive. His powers were real. The journey ended at the Magic Crystal Mines, a place that, unlike what Xeon had imagined, was not full of gloomy tunnels, but of people moving about and festivities taking place. He was left alone by a supervisor who warned he would return shortly with the manager, ironically and cruelly suggesting that the boy make use of the time. Hungry, Xeon looked for a store. That was when he found an old vendor of hardened appearance, with hands marked by scars. The old man pointed to a sign on the wall that praised workers as a true source of energy in the city. Not mana stones, but people like Xeon. Disposable, replaceable, endless. Xeon shot back with sarcasm, but the old man continued. Somehow, he already knew about the boy's descent into the belly of one of those creatures, and instead of being impressed, he showed only coldness, stating that a boy like him would be back inside the belly of one of those creatures sooner than he imagined.
imagined, because this was no place for naive. The boy insisted he was there only to earn money. The old man pointed to the back of the store, a pile of objects accumulated over time, and then revealed what it was: the belongings of everyone who had passed through there before. Each one arrived with hope. Each one tried to resist the temptation of the mana stones. Each one ended up selling everything they had to survive a little longer, and each one ended up the same way. The old man said plainly that rats like Zeon would not even leave a name behind. Zeon ignored the speech and asked for the price. The answer was absurd: dozens for the simplest drink in the store. While he tried to defend himself and question the absurdity, he realized too late that he was completely surrounded. More than a dozen armed men were waiting around him, silent as the wind over sand. The old man assumed his role as the boss of that environment, and with a calm smile, pointed to something in Zeon's pocket, a mana stone. He suggested that it would be adequate payment. Zeon refused with everything he had. He had gone through hell to obtain that stone, and he would not give it up even if they surrounded him with twice as many men. Zeon tried to negotiate with Klexi, but words held no value in that place. A muscular brute grabbed him by the head and smashed his face against the table, suggesting they bury the boy right there. In Zeon's mind, the response was immediate and devastating. He activated explosive sand, tore the man's arm from his body, and swept all the corrupt men from the area with a rain of sand spikes. But none of that actually happened.
In reality, Zeon passed out with a bleeding nose, cursing his own fate as he lost consciousness. With no way out, he had to hand the mana stone over to Klexi, exactly what the old man had wanted from the start. The elder examined the stone with surprise, commenting that it was worth around 100 souls. Zeon grumbled that the real value was at least 3 times that, given its size. Klexi was not intimidated. With every advantage in hand, he humiliated the boy once more, saying it would have been better if he had turned into sandworm compost instead of showing up there. Another blow to the table. Zeon was at his limit. He could feel his powers boiling inside him, but he knew he was not yet strong enough to act. So he backed down and demanded at least a bonus in exchange for the stone. The old man agreed, but advised the boy to watch out for pickpockets around there. As part of the deal, he said Zeon could choose anything from the pile of junk in the back of the store. The boy rummaged through the heap without finding anything of value, until his eyes landed on an object that even caught Klexi's own attention: a small hourglass. Leaving behind the old clothes and useless clutter, Zeon walked out with that as his only gain. Before crossing the doorway, he asked for the old man's name. Klexi answered out loud, without any embarrassment. Zeon burned the name deep into his memory, leaving in the air a silent threat that he hoped not to have to meet him again. The old man showed not the slightest sign of concern. Back in his quarters, Zeon examined the hourglass carefully. He noticed that the full cycle lasted about 10 minutes. To test his powers, he took a deep breath, focused all his attention on the object, and mentally commanded the sand inside to move. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. He stared at his own reflection in frustration, unable to understand why his powers did not respond to direct command. All he knew about his ability was that it emerged by instinct, and that no one before had ever demonstrated anything like it. Still trying to comprehend the strange feeling the hourglass stirred in him, the door was kicked in by a man who entered shouting, asking if he was the newcomer who had just arrived. Manhwa had no patience whatsoever. He cursed and humiliated Zeon for not already being in the mine. When the boy tried to demand respect, he took an uppercut that sent him flying through the air. The second punch came straight to the abdomen, followed by stumps, calculated and cold, as if Zeon were nothing more than an obstacle in his way. Manhwa made it clear that non-awakened with attitude were meant to lower their heads and take it in silence. Satisfied with the beating, he ordered the boy to follow him. Zeon got up without backing down. Before even taking his first step, he had already decided, one day, with his own hands, he would put an end to Manhwa. One more name on the list. In the third sector of the mine entrance, he was hastily equipped. The costs of food and equipment would be deducted from his pay, and the mission was simple: dig and collect mana stones. Before he could ask any questions, Manhwa destroyed the boy's helmet with his own pickaxe, informing him that the deduction for the equipment would also be applied, with or without fault.
fault. Zeon was assigned to Pit 972, described as one of the worst places in the mine. There was no discussion. The order was clear. Coming back without a mana stone meant immediate execution. The subordinate responsible for accompanying him descended with Zeon, confirming that this was the worst sector in existence, and also revealed that Manhwa's bad mood that day was the result of a string of losses at the mine's casino. Zeon was surprised to learn that there was even a casino there. The subordinate explained that there was a little of everything, not much different from Neil's soul. Along the way, the boy admitted he had never handled a pickaxe in his life, and that his skin was far too sensitive for that kind of work. His companion responded with a crooked smile that it would not be a problem at all, because not one of the more than a dozen people sent into that tunnel had gotten hurt. Not one of them had come back. When they reached the tunnel, Zeon asked if he just needed to collect the crystals and head back up. The subordinate cut him off before he could finish the sentence. No one had come out of there. More than 12 people had disappeared. 4 were still betting on surviving. Of the rest, there was no news, alive or dead. The man said goodbye with an apology and a thank you for venturing into a place that no sane human being would touch, and simply walked away. Zeon was left alone. Anger replaced fear. He was there to die because of a bully's wounded ego. He raised the pickaxe, struck the first blow, and the handle snapped, sending the pool to the other side of the tunnel. With no other option, he went to retrieve the pickaxe in the dark and noticed something that had gone unnoticed until then. The concentration of mana in that sector was absurdly dense. Any ordinary person would have already collapsed. The fact that Zeon was still standing confirmed what he had already suspected about himself. Before he could process any of it, he misstepped, and the floor simply vanished beneath his feet. A portal opened and swallowed him whole with the helmet and the broken pickaxe. The fall unleashed fragments of the past, flashes of a brutal childhood, the voices around him saying he would not go far, the beatings for simply wanting to eat, the dreams destroyed before they could even bloom, the weight of having taken a life without meaning to, the guilt of the name Li Jirong echoing like a sentence, and the desperate sprint towards anything that was different from all of that. Zeon woke up somewhere else. The air was suffocatingly hot, gray everywhere. He cursed his own fate upon realizing where he had ended up. An igneous dungeon, a volcanic hell beneath the earth. He picked up a rock without thinking and dropped it immediately, burning his hand. He wrapped a piece of his own pants around his mouth to filter out the volcanic ash, and assessed the situation coldly. If this place had an entrance, it had an exit. The highest point, the peak of the eruption, was the most likely way out. He shot toward the objective with a determination that bordered on the absurd, proclaiming out loud that he was the almighty Zeon, the man who does not back down from any obstacle. A few seconds later, the ground gave way beneath his feet, and he nearly plunged straight into the lava, catching himself by his arms at the last instant, with the lower half of his body suspended over the incandescent heat. He managed to pull himself out, gasping. Instead of fear, what remained was rage, all of it directed at Manhwa. He swore on his own hands that that debt would be collected when he got out of there, but he reined in the emotion and returned to focus. Only 4 jumps left to the highest point. No hesitation, no retreat. His consciousness began to waver. The suffocating heat burned from the inside. The volcanic ash made every breath a struggle. With his clarity slipping through his fingers, Zeon refused to give in, motivated among other things by the thought that he had not even had a girlfriend yet, and that dying there would be profoundly unjust. And it was precisely at that moment that the lesser cousin of the apocalypse emerged from the lava, a colossal creature with open jaws that snatched him out of midair before plunging back into the bubbling depths. Except Zeon was no longer between its jaws. He had managed to reach a ledge on the other side, clinging to the rock with what little strength he had left. The confrontation with the creature had taught him something valuable. Inside that dungeon, it was possible to manipulate the volcanic ash the same way he manipulated sand, and that was exactly what had saved him. Half conscious beside the sleeping snout of the monster, Zeon felt the last sparks of lucidity fading away, but even so, he stood up one more time. He mentally apologized to his uncle for what he was about to do, and channeled every bit of control he had over the volcanic ash to take the next step. The creature emerged from the lava a second time with even more violence than before. Zeon responded the only way he could, fighting to stay alive at any cost. It was then that a voice cut through the surrounding chaos, praising the boy's unique ability with genuine admiration. Before he could identify the source of the sound, a figure descended from above as if launched from some invisible point high up. A man of aged appearance fell toward the creature with his sword already drawn, gaining absurd speed during the descent. The impact was catastrophic. The single strike altered the course of the lava around it, sent debris spiraling throughout the cavern, and generated a shockwave so brutal that Xion's eardrum simply gave out. The boy could barely stand on his feet from the pressure of the impact alone. When the dust settled enough to see, the monster had been cut in two. That man was no ordinary awakened. He was something categorically different from anything Xion had witnessed until then. With every step the old man took, the ground gave way beneath his feet, as if the very environment respected him. Xion stood frozen just from watching. The stranger asked for the boy's name. Receiving no answer, he began a countdown, and upon reaching 1, he was already standing over Xion like a shadow that had appeared from nowhere. Then he simply stared at him, questioning why the boy looked so terrified. His hearing returned partially, and the panic came with it. Xion shouted that he did not understand anything that was happening and begged for mercy. The old man seemed satisfied with the reaction. At least the boy was not a completely lost cause. He asked for the name again, and this time received the answer, Xion. The old man grimaced upon hearing it, judging the name as something pitiful. Xion was indignant, wanting to know what kind of name the old man himself carried to give him the right to criticize his. With a brusque gesture, the man destroyed a nearby rock and introduced himself, Diadin. Xion didn't understand the theatrics. Diadin was confused by the boy's confusion, so Xion got straight to the point. He complained about being insulted and threatened without reason, even after having his life saved. Grateful as he was, he saw no reason for that treatment. Diadin called him an idiot once more and explained what had happened. Xion had fallen into a dungeon trap, a phenomenon that occurs when a dungeon's mana reaches supersaturation. To prevent an internal collapse, the environment tears open a rift and drains the excess through it, pulling along every living creature in the vicinity. Most people never experience this. Xion's luck was simply the worst possible. One more reason to settle the score with Manhwa. Diadin frowned and told the boy to do something simple: concentrate mana into his own eyes. Xion did not understand until he actually tried. When he did, what lay before him left him speechless. The old man explained. There was a stealth magic beast lurking nearby, a creature that eliminated its prey before they even detected their presence. That monster had been in front of Xion the entire time, without him picking up the slightest sign of danger. And when Diadin had destroyed that rock moments earlier, it was not theatrics, it was the second monster being taken down. Without the old man's intervention, Xion would have died without even understanding what had killed him. That was already the second time. Consumed by curiosity, Xion urgently asked who Diadin really was. The old man answered only that he was good old Diadin, and nothing more. Xion shouted, wanting to know how someone could be so absurdly powerful. When he asked where they were, Diadin answered with the utmost naturalness, inside a dungeon, his own hunting ground. Then he warned that it was time to pay attention, because he was about to show what he was capable of. The old man drew his sword and shouted "Crayon." The shockwave of the ability spread throughout the entire cavern, forcing Xion to cover his ears tightly. When the noise died enough to open his eyes, the boy realized the dungeon was infested with flame-like creatures, swarms of them, in every direction. Diadin seemed genuinely excited by what he saw. Then, turning to Xion, he said with complete calm that the boy was on his own now, that he should figure out how to survive. Xion cursed the old man while looking around in despair. He was completely surrounded, with no visible escape route. The creatures moved too fast to be tracked with the naked eye, delivering continuous strikes that slowly tore his clothes apart. The boy tried to hurl sand at the flying beasts, but they dodged with ease and responded with multiple simultaneous attacks. Completely useless against that situation, he used his arms to shield his face while the blows kept coming without stop. Then he noticed something strange. The creatures kept targeting exclusively his left side. Why? The answer came from a recent memory. Diadin had told him to see through mana, not through his eyes. Xion mentally called himself a pathetic loser, but refused to fall. He began concentrating mana into his eyes, gradually refining the purity, breathing deeply, forcing his focus amid the chaos. And then, it worked. He started to feel the flow of magical energy within the beasts. He could track them now. The instant the mana of two of them entered his range, he struck at the closest possible point and brought them down. Meanwhile, Diadin was at the center of a completely different battle, facing much larger creatures with a smile on his face. He remarked that he could barely remember the last time he had felt so excited during a fight. With a single punch, he split a colossal crocodile-like monster in two. After the strike, he looked at the falling creature and murmured that it was a shame it had not even been a real opponent. He sighed, commenting that the number of dungeons had dropped drastically compared to when he was younger. Zeon, who had watched the crocodile be eliminated like a fly, felt something close to pity for the creature. It was hard not to. But before he could think too much about it, a violent shockwave hit him, sending him to his knees while his stomach lurched. He barely managed to get up and asked the old man what that had been. Diodine explained calmly. What Zeon had felt was the roar of the dungeon boss. Every dungeon has one, and this one's was the real reason the old man had come there. A massive creature descended from the heights of the cavern. Diodine identified it as a crimson drake. Zeon immediately asked if that was a dragon. The old man flatly denied it, adding that it was regrettable having to deal with a Class B creature when he preferred to face real dragons. Even so, the drake was clearly dangerous, enveloped in a powerful field structure. By the awakened classification system, a red aura would tell you that it was a melee fight, but when Zeon noticed that the aura surrounding that creature was blue, he shouted that it meant the drake was of the magical type. Before any reaction was possible, the drake unleashed the black flame attack directly at both of them. Zeon froze, mouth open, body locked, all control completely lost. Diodine, on the other hand, leapt straight toward the source of the attack and swung his sword at the creature's head. The drake recovered quickly and retaliated with its claws. Diodine used Crayon to counter, but in an unexpected turn, ended up caught in the creature's claw. The drake took advantage and prepared a point-blank fire breath. Diodine reacted before the blast. He forced the drake's mouth shut, trapping the flames inside the creature's own body. He asked the monster if it could feel the pain, then warned that it was all about to end for good. Tightening his fist on the sword, he advanced, declaring that this would be the creature's last day. Zeon, meanwhile, was running for his life. Caught in the middle of that overwhelming battle, he could not even find space to breathe properly. He used his ability to raise a sand wall behind him, trying to block the shockwaves coming in sequence. He shouted for the two of them to take the fight somewhere else, unable to understand how mere shockwaves could cause so much damage to him. Diodine seemed to be having the time of his life. He shouted that it was like being at an amusement park. Then another shockwave came, too fast. Zeon had no time to react. The impact launched him brutally through the air and sent him hurtling toward the magma. The boy went still for a second, fully aware that he was about to die, and that he would die without ever having had a girlfriend. Diodine, indifferent to the boy's condition, turned all his attention back to the Crimson Drake. He taunted the creature, calling it a disgrace to all dungeon bosses for fighting so pathetically. Pushed to the limit by the insults, the Drake charged up a concentrated breath attack. Diodine smiled. He had not expected the opponent to have something like that in reserve. The magical breath tore through everything in its path, growing in intensity as it advanced, obliterating the surrounding environment. When it finally stopped, the Crimson Drake stood still, convinced that the lunatic had been reduced to dust. The creature had no time to react.
The instant its voice echoed asking if there was anyone still around, it was already too late. A roar of agony tore through the air as it turned to face Diodine, crouching with absolute indifference atop its colossal body, his sword buried more than a meter inside it. With complete calm, he revealed that he had been searching for a creature of that type for a very long time. After all, he needed the heart of a Crimson Drake for Crayon to grow. It was a shame, but the beast simply had no other way out. With that, he pushed the blade even deeper, letting the magic spread through the monster's interior. The immense body convulsed in violent spasms as the blade ran through it from side to side. After absorbing the Drake's heart, Crayon began to pulse with an intense and powerful crimson aura. Diodine gazed at the sword with a satisfied look, convinced that it had broken through yet another one of its limits. That almost contemplative moment was abruptly interrupted by Zeon, who appeared out of nowhere and demanded to know why on earth the man kept talking to his own weapon like a lunatic. The guy might be completely off his rocker, but his strength was undeniable. After all, he had just taken down a Crimson Drake on his own. Diodine was genuinely surprised to see the boy still standing. Zeon explained that he had crawled back from the edge of death after the ground gave way beneath his feet. Rather than passively accepting the end, he had used his sand manipulation to create a buffer that softened the fall just enough to keep him from turning into human paste. He himself could barely believe how good he had gotten at cheating death. He added, with irony, that getting constantly battered by the shockwaves of a certain lunatic had sharpened his reflexes considerably. Diodine showed a slight admiration, but there was something more urgent to deal with. Without ceremony, the old man grabbed him by the shirt as if handling a lost child, and warned that the dungeon was
was collapsing now that the boss had been eliminated. They needed to get out immediately. Zeon was confused about what that had to do with being carried around like a bag of groceries. The answer was a thunderous laugh, not because the remark was funny, but because of what came next. Without any warning, the old man hurled Zeon through a rift that opened before them and let out a casual, "See ya." Moments later, Zeon unleashed every word he knew, going as far as to compare him to the infamous Park Man-ho. A moment later, he was spat out the other side of the rift, dragged across the sand several times before coming to a stop. Spitting grains from his mouth and completely disoriented, he tried to figure out where he had ended up. Dioden explained with complete calm that they were on the surface. When a dungeon boss is defeated, rifts to the outside open as natural exits. Upon hearing that, Zeon immediately complained that they could have simply walked out like normal people instead of being launched like garbage. The old man lost his patience and got straight to the point. He admitted that the boy's sand powers were genuinely useful, but that in his current state, he was worth no more than a dull knife. Because of that, he presented two choices. The first was to head south to New Seoul City and keep on living as the same nobody as always. The second was the fun path. Under his guidance, Zeon would go from being a clueless idiot to a faster and stronger idiot. The boy, taken aback, wanted to know exactly what that meant and how long it would take. Dioden answered plainly that he had absolutely no idea. It could be months, years, or decades. Predicting the future was not among his abilities. Faced with a choice capable of completely changing his path, Zeon stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The old man summed it all up brutally. On one side, the same boring life as always. On the other, a path of extreme acceleration with a 99% chance of death. The boy started laughing like a madman and questioned whether the man had completely lost his mind. He then put on a dramatic performance pretending he had a luxurious palace and a comfortable bed waiting for him, and asked if the old man really expected him to give all of that up to follow a foul-smelling geyser through scorching deserts with no guarantees, especially when the master himself could drop dead at any moment given his advanced age. Dioden confirmed that was exactly what he expected. Zeon let out an exaggerated sigh, playing up the weight of the decision, but ended up agreeing. He explained that whenever someone irritated him, he needed to settle the score right then and there, and that for now, he was too weak to do so. He also said that Dioden was on his list of unfinished business, and that compared to anyone he had faced until then, the old man was on a whole different level. He doubted he would find anyone stronger. While going on with excessive confidence, Dioden cut him off and taunted him, insinuating that so much confidence sounded like being in a hurry to die young. Zeon clenched his fist and declared that he would become stronger than everyone. Dioden shot back that that kind of attitude only brought him closer to an early grave, and told him to keep walking, calling him an idiot while warning that there was still a long way ahead. As time passed, Zeon was drenched in sweat and could barely keep up with the old man's pace. He asked for them to slow down and rest. They had already been walking for 6 hours. He shouted several times, but Dioden simply ignored him, pressing on in absolute silence. Zeon grumbled to himself, unable to understand why he was putting up with those sudden mood swings. The heat was suffocating. The loose sand made every step an effort, and he began to fear he would pass out from heat stroke before reaching anywhere. Just at the moment when he was about to give in, Dioden finally turned to him, as if he had been waiting for precisely that instant. He called him a fool for not even being able to use a fraction of his own power. Zeon looked confused, and the old man reminded him of the obvious. He was a sand manipulation user and was having trouble walking on sand, which should be the easiest environment for him. When Zeon tried to justify himself by saying he had only woken up to his powers a few days ago and was still class F, Dioden lost his patience instantly. He told him to stop with that nonsensical talk and made it clear that he cared absolutely nothing about classification. He questioned whether the boy truly believed people were born into class S, as if he were the only one at a disadvantage. He grabbed him by the collar and asked if he planned to give up simply because he felt he had not been blessed. Then he dropped him onto the sand and told him to figure out on his own how to use his ability, to use his head to understand his own power, since he needed to know it inside and out if he wanted to push past its limits. Just as Zeon was starting to think the old man had a point, Dioden started shouting again and threatened that he would be dead if he did not figure it out soon. Zeon started his analysis from scratch. He knew his sand manipulation range was only 5 meters. He observed that the sand was at ankle height and concluded that if he could solidify it, he would create a kind of firm footing and save energy with every step. He tried condensing the grains around his feet until they turned solid, and it worked. Walking through the scorching desert became considerably easier. However, However, he soon realized how much mana was being consumed and understood that he would not be able to sustain it for long. He moved on to his next plan and tried concentrating mana directly into his legs, which also worked surprisingly well. Watching him test things repeatedly with renewed energy, Dioden allowed a faint smile, remembering his own younger days. Even though Zeon kept insisting on calling himself Class F, the old man was certain his mana control and true potential were at least level E or D. Excited by the discovery, Zeon ran up to Dioden shouting that he had figured out the trick. All he had to do was control the sand in contact with his feet to make each step lighter. At the height of his arrogance, he even flipped the old man off as a provocation. The response was a precise punch to the head. Dioden told him to stop wasting time on nonsense if he did not want to die. Zeon dropped immediately and lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he found his face covered in sand and pressed against the ground, in the dark. Dioden was chewing on a piece of dried meat and said with indifference that he was glad he had finally woken up. It had been quite a task carrying him there. While Zeon tried to sit up, complaining about his wrecked body, the old man tossed a handful of dried meat in his direction and began telling a story from his younger years. Back then, being weak did not mean a death sentence. Protecting the weak was considered the noble duty of those who held power. But that world had disappeared long ago, and it was clear that Dioden missed it. The story ended as quickly as it had begun, and the old man told Zeon to get up soon if he did not appreciate the idea of dying. This time, the boy listened in silence without talking back. To his surprise, Dioden tossed him another piece of dried meat. The story of those ancient times made the other man see Zeon in a new light. Behind the weathered appearance and the difficult temperament, Dioden carried decades, perhaps centuries, of experience and wisdom. Watching him eat, Dioden noticed a curious detail. Even with those teeth worn by time, the old man showed no difficulty with the dried meat. Paying close attention, he discovered the secret. Instead of biting directly into it, he moistened it with saliva before chewing. That was the right way to consume it in an arid desert like that one. Dioden wasn't just feeding the boy, he was teaching him, in a silent way, to survive on his own. The difference between giving a fish and teaching someone to fish. In time, the cold of the desert began to make itself felt with force, and he started sneezing non-stop, shaking uncontrollably in the freezing night. Dioden, on the other hand, stretched as if he were on a peaceful beach, completely oblivious to the cold. Zeon still could not understand why the lunatic kept insisting on talking to his sword all the time. Thirst came soon after, and he asked for water, but the old man solemnly ignored him and drank it all himself, without the slightest ceremony. Rage took hold of Zeon, but even so, he watched closely. Unlike Dioden, he did not have enough fabric to squeeze out dew. Even so, he crouched down and began licking the tiny drops of moisture that formed on his own body. Like a determined stray dog, he would do whatever was necessary to reach the master's level. Dioden called him a fool. Zeon shot back that he was not a fool, he was an idiot with pride. The old man told him to be quiet and focus on sensing the surroundings. Without understanding why, Zeon obeyed and tried to perceive the environment around him. After a few moments, he began picking up subtle vibrations coming from multiple directions. Before he could fully process what that meant, hundreds of gleaming eyes appeared in the shadows, surrounding them completely. Wild beasts, ready to tear apart anything within reach of their jaws. Horned hyenas were nocturnal creatures, but bad luck had it that the two of them were caught right at dawn. While the beasts bared their fangs and prepared to attack, Dioden asked with irony whether the boy could handle it, or whether he needed a little help from Daddy. The madness seemed contagious, because Zeon laughed and assured him he did not need help from any dusty old man. Rallying the sand around him, he prepared for a fight to the death. The offensive began with a sand bullet fired directly at one of the hyenas. Then, enormous spikes of hardened sand burst from the ground, creating a lethal zone that eliminated any creature that dared enter its range. But as the confrontation dragged on, exhaustion began to set in. Zeon growled in frustration, feeling as if he were stuck in an endless zombie loop. The pain burned in his chest, and he nearly crumbled, realizing he could die from mana exhaustion before the beasts even finished the job. The conclusion was inevitable. Pure brute force was not enough. He needed to fight more intelligently. With a new condensed sand bullet in his palm, he tried to think about how to conserve energy, but was interrupted when a hyena lunged and sunk its teeth deep into his arm. He managed to break free, but the damage was brutal. The arm was torn with deep holes like Swiss cheese. Paradoxically, it was precisely precisely that wound that triggered the moment of clarity he needed. The holes revealed the most efficient way to apply his sand manipulation. Xian stood still for an instant, planning in silence, while the pack advanced hungrily toward him. Before they could reach him, he unleashed his new technique. Hundreds of extremely thin spikes burst from the ground simultaneously, piercing every beast at the same time, and turning the entire pack into hyenas skewered like kebabs. He burst out laughing just like his own master. Watching enemies fall to a single precise strike was far more satisfying than wasting energy blowing everything up. Mana spent recklessly was the fastest path to death. His spike traps, punching clean and precise holes, were the definition of efficiency. Meanwhile, Diadun fought in a completely different way, slower, facing enemies head-on, one by one. The hyenas hung from his arms and bit with force, but the lunatic just laughed as if the creatures were tickling him. After having enough fun, a violet glow lit up his eyes as he finally decided to get serious. Upon catching that insane expression, Xian immediately understood what was coming and braced himself, already dreading having to endure that madness again. With a crooked smile, Diadun ordered Crayon to eliminate the enemies. In fractions of a second, an explosion of power erupted, sending shockwaves that swept sand and beasts alike across the battlefield. Xian barely had time to raise a sand wall to protect himself, as the hyenas were catapulted like projectiles. When everything settled, he stood in complete disbelief before the epicenter of the explosion and the trail of destruction stretching out ahead. It made him seriously question whether Diadun was even human, because no normal person would produce that without using some specific ability. At the same time, it became clear that being arrogant around the monster of that level was a guaranteed recipe for an early death. At that moment, Diadun began coughing hard, choking on the very dust he had kicked up. Seizing the opening, the alpha-horned hyena charged and pierced him with its lightning-charged horn. Caught off guard, the old man looked down with mild confusion, wondering why that beast had some kind of magical field around it. He had clearly underestimated that one in particular. It was at the very least class B-. Seeing the master in mortal danger, Xian panicked and shouted for him to watch out. The concern proved entirely unnecessary. Diadun grabbed the hyena's horn as if it were an inanimate object, without even reacting to the electrical discharge running through him. Xian locked up, unable to process what he was witnessing. Even the alpha itself was unsettled, and backed away upon seeing the old man enjoying the electrical discharge as if it were a relaxing massage session. After savoring the treatment, Diadun calmly informed the creature that it was time to wrap things up. He leapt onto the alpha and drove his sword deep into its body, spreading blood across the entire field. Xian watched all of it and concluded that he had been an idiot at some point for having worried about this man. After the battle, the two of them began harvesting materials from the horned hyenas. While working on the alpha's hide, Xian asked when they would finally leave that place. He was surprised to see Diadun collecting even the horns, which he explained were valuable materials for crafting lightning-based weapons. Suddenly, Diadun tossed the dagger to the boy, a weapon for hunting. He made it clear that from that moment on, Xian would have to fend for himself to get food. No handouts. Horned hyena meat was mostly venomous, and a bite in the wrong spot would kill him. Only the flank muscle was safe for consumption. While Diadun cut his own portion with ease, he noticed the boy standing there and watching, and scolded him to stop standing there with his mouth open. If he wanted to survive, he better start working before dawn. With that, Xian got to work and kept harvesting meat until the sun finally rose. He already seemed more experienced than a few days prior. Even without a proper water source, he had plenty of meat stored, and his ability to walk on sand made daytime travel much easier. In a moment of arrogance, he taunted the old man, asking if he was having trouble walking and whether he was jealous of his neat little trick. This time, Xian managed to dodge the punch and stuck his tongue out like a brat. But the second strike, delivered with crayon, landed square and knocked some sense back into his skull. Spitting sand, Diadun said plainly that his back hurt a great deal, and that a cheap locomotion trick did not make anyone special. Xian sulked, arguing he was just joking around. He was already thirsty, and now his mouth was full of dry sand. It was then that he noticed something different. His mouth was no longer as parched. The air carried a faint trace of moisture. For a second, he considered whether he was hallucinating, but the expression on Diadon's face confirmed it was real. On the other side of the dune ahead was what every desert traveler dreams of finding: an oasis. Xian climbed the dune and began screaming with euphoria at the sight of the lake for the first time in his life. He ignored every precaution and ran down in a frenzy, desperate for that water. The old man clicked his tongue in disappointment, but did not stop him. The boy ran straight to the shore and plunged his face into the water, letting his parched skin absorb every drop of moisture. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts dissolve. It was the first time since he had arrived in that scorching desert that he had allowed his body to truly cool down. Suddenly, something caught his attention. A bright light pulsed slowly from the depths of the lake. Xian became hypnotized, his eyes locked on that glow, and he gradually lost awareness that he was out of air. It was Diadon who shouted his name and came rushing down the slope at full speed, but the boy was paralyzed, unaware that an enormous monster fish was silently approaching from below. At the last instant, the old man pulled him out of the water before he became food. He threw Xian to the ground, leapt high into the air, and faced the creature head-on. With a clean sword strike, he brought the monster down instantly. Meanwhile, the boy watched everything with wide eyes, and then got distracted by the rainbow that formed over the oasis. Diadon dragged a giant fish out of the water and explained that it was a sand anglerfish, a creature that used the light on its head to hypnotize prey before devouring them. The old man's expression turned serious shortly after, and proceeded to harshly scold Xian for forgetting everything he had been taught and letting his guard down so recklessly. He finished by saying that careless fools like him were always the first to die in the unforgiving environment of the desert. Xian could only nod, and Diadon let out a sigh. Seeing that his student was listening for once, he dropped a subject and ordered him to start skinning the monster. The sand anglerfish was a Class C magical beast, and the skin of its belly was the ideal material for crafting a cloak. Xian was confused and asked whether the old man really needed a cloak, a comment that nearly drove Diadon completely over the edge. Having reached his daily limit of stupidity, he began ranting and called the boy slower than a starfish. The boy comically began bleeding from his ears and apologized with a nervous smile. Diadon continued, explaining that although the fish had undergone mutations, it still bore similarities to the species that had lived on Earth. He told Xian to pay close attention, as it was the first time he had ever seen a real fish. The boy came to the conclusion that fish were genuinely terrifying creatures, and then began skinning. Seeing the delicate way he handled the knife, Diadon told him to stop treating the fish as though he were giving his grandmother a massage. Xian shot back, telling the old man to mind his own business, but returned his focus to the task. He noticed the skin was too tough for a regular knife, so he channeled mana into the blade, sharpening it enough to cut with ease. He used the knife to scrape off the scales, turning them into small needles, and used the tendons connecting the flesh to the bones as sewing thread. Despite all the creativity, the result was a completely crooked and messy cloak. Leaning back against the dead fish, the old man scolded him for wasting such good material on something so useless. But Xian did not give up and tried again with the remaining material. A few hours later, he succeeded and held up a cloak that this time actually looked decent. Excited, he commented that he could probably sell those for a profit and even open his own tailor shop. Diodin called his name in a tone that made the boy react immediately, already ready to defend the cloak. But the old man was holding a large organ resembling a pouch still dripping with blood and told Xian to start eating. It was a gallbladder, a rare and extremely powerful medicine. The boy tried to argue, but Diodin made it clear that the alternative was being beaten to death. He dropped the heavy organ into the student's hand, complaining that his arms were tired. Faced with that disgusting mass, Xian hesitated for a moment, then began swallowing like a starving man. The flavor was more bitter than orange juice after toothpaste, but he kept going, not wanting to be beaten. Strangely, after a few bites, the hunger only grew, and he kept eating more and more until he finished everything. No sooner had he finished than Diodin warned him that now it was time to burn. Xian did not immediately understand until he felt his throat close up and began to choke. Inside, it was as though a nuclear reactor was in meltdown. The heat spread violently throughout his entire body, completely out of control. He began screaming in unbearable pain, while the old man told him to stop acting like a child. Diodin then launched into a monologue, saying that everything in life was like that oasis, destined to vanish as though it had never existed. He explained that sand angler fish were reborn, keeping the cycle in balance. Before he could finish, Xian interrupted him in agony, begging him to drop the sappy stories and do something. Even watching the boy writhing on the ground like a worm in salt, Diodin did not move a muscle. and simply went to sleep. The following day, Xion finally opened his eyes and found the old man staring down at him with a crooked, mischievous smile. The shock nearly scared his soul out of his body, and he yelled at Diodin for almost giving him a heart attack. After exchanging a few more kind words, as usual, the old man asked how he was feeling now. Xion immediately noticed that something had changed within him. His body felt incredibly lighter, his muscles conveyed a strength that had not been there before, and the mana inside him pulsed as though it were about to overflow. Testing his newly enhanced capabilities, he asked what had happened. He felt as though he had taken some kind of super soldier serum. Dio then explained that it was the effect of the fish's gallbladder. The organ functioned as a cheat item for desert survival, making anyone who consumed it considerably stronger. This was something extremely valuable, which made Xion suspicious about why he had been allowed to eat it. The old man brushed the matter aside, saying he had only done it because the boy was far too weak and he did not want to slow his pace because of him. Xion argued that he was useful every now and then, but Diodine told him to be quiet and start eating. They would not leave until the fish was completely consumed. 4 days later, the sand angler fish had been reduced to nothing but clean bones. The old man declared it was time to move on. Xion smiled, put on his new cloak, and the two resumed their journey. A few days later, dust-laden winds swept across the horizon, announcing the beginning of a sandstorm. Thanks to his new strength, Xion was not greatly affected by the phenomenon, and was surprised to see that Diodine also kept his pace without slowing his step. The old man had been in complete silence for days, which made the boy wonder if the man was going through some kind of late existential crisis. It had been 2 weeks of walking, and he began to seriously question whether Diodine knew where they were headed. It was then that a monster ant emerged behind Xion, who reacted quickly with a sand beam. He assumed they would continue without further trouble, but the creature was still standing. He acknowledged that the creature was more resilient than he had expected. Using his sand manipulation to sense the terrain around him, he noticed more ants approaching and decided to confront them head-on. He plunged his hand into the sand and forced the creatures to surface as they began to surround him. Slightly bored from eliminating wave after wave, Xion kept blasting the insects, and his technique had visibly evolved in a short time. Deep down, he acknowledged that sandstorm days were almost advantageous for his power. There was practically unlimited ammunition in every direction he looked. Diodine, for his part, maintained his relentless pace without even glancing back, leaving the boy to deal with the plague coming from behind. Xion complained about the bare minimum of loyalty, concluding that it was no wonder the old man had grown old alone. In the middle of his complaints, Xion picked up something disturbing within his 10-meter detection range. Always on alert, he never let his guard down. This allowed him to react instantly to any magical beast that appeared. But what he sensed in that instant was unlike anything before. A chill ran down his spine. What was approaching was not just a common beast, it was terror in physical form. The next moment, a countless number of ants burst from the ground, all at once. The army appeared out of nowhere. Xion turned to Diodine asking for help, admitting that this was beyond his capabilities. The old man simply stared at him and sat down comfortably to watch, as if all that was missing was a bag of popcorn in his hand. Xion understood that no help would come, and deep down he knew he could not depend on the old man every time the situation got tight. There was no way Diodine hadn't sensed that threat approaching. It was a test, a mission. Whether there were 1,000 or 10,000 creatures, an insect was still an insect, so he formed a rolling sand sphere and trapped the army inside. Keeping the structure intact took effort, and it grew even harder when a new batch of ants emerged to disrupt his flow. Xion's confidence began to crack as he was dragged around like dead weight. In desperation, he even challenged the ants to fight him face to face like real men instead of swarming him. The creatures completely ignored the provocation and kept swarming him as though he were the most appetizing snack in the desert. Finding an opening, he hardened sand beneath his feet and used the platform to gain altitude. Even up high, the ants found a way by linking themselves together and forming a colossal structure to reach him. Xion flew desperately toward higher ground in search of a better view of the situation. But who would have thought that giant ants could build a living anthill by linking their own bodies? He nearly lost control when his sand platform was immobilized. The chirping of the creatures was disturbing as they clung to his ankle as though their lives depended on it. He was dragged without ceremony and violently thrown against the sand. It took him a moment to get up, gasping and spitting blood. When he raised his head, Diodin Theoden was still watching with a completely indifferent gaze. It was precisely that indifference that gave him the fuel to keep going. He wanted to prove he could survive that ordeal. For the first time since the fight began, Theoden showed a positive reaction. He appreciated the boy's spirit, even though he was still an idiot. In a world reduced to sand and ruins, Xion's ability was an undeniable blessing. He could have taken advantage of that power to live a comfortable existence, but that would be the end of any real growth, a superficial life. Those of narrow mind get lost in illusions and do not even know why the world came to be in that state. A true awakened is destined to dominate, utilize, and push his own capabilities to the absolute limit. That power was not made for mass-produced soldiers. Theoden was one of the few who still remembered. Most had forgotten the tragedy that shook the foundations of the world 100 years ago. Back then, he was powerless beyond any help. He had lost count of the people who died before his eyes. Companions, neighbors, family. What hurt the most was the loss of his daughter. He had never felt so paralyzed, so useless. But Xion was different. He had never wavered, even with the odds unfairly against him. He had the potential to become anything he wanted, as long as he was crazy enough to repeatedly cross the line between life and death. Those who dared to bridge that boundary would grow at a pace that defied any expectation. As though he had lost the last remnant of his sanity, Xion laughed in the face of the ant arm. In the middle of the battle, he created a new technique, an ultra-compressed sand missile of high velocity. It was simple and brute, but its destructive capacity was genuine. Every projectile he launched carried compressed gravity, wind, and all the energy he could mobilize. It was greater than the sum of its parts, a synergy that multiplied power tenfold. The ants had failed to eliminate him before he adapted, and now it was their turn to be decimated. Theoden smiled watching the boy completely thrilled with his little invention. When the bombardment ended, the surrounding terrain was unrecognizable, filled with craters opened at every point. Xion was satisfied with himself. It was cause for celebration. So eager to boast to the old man, he did not notice the threat coming from the flank. The largest ant of the colony had emerged in absolute silence and seized him with his mandibles with brutal force. It was impossible for those creatures to master a high-level stealth ability, and yet it had been invisible to him. The strange sensation he had noticed in his body suddenly made complete sense. He was poisoned.
Progressively, control over his mana slipped from his hand. The poison was blocking his newly established mana point. Trapped and powerless, all he could do was hurl obscenities. The giant ant was completely immune to his foul mouth. To it, he was nothing more than another prey to be captured. When Xion regained consciousness, he was deep inside an underground tunnel, surrounded by his worst enemy, an anthill. Sensing the arrival of food, the colony larvae darted toward the paralyzed human. The shrill screams and alien appearance of the creatures were disturbing to say the least. As soon as they confirmed he posed no threat, the larvae crawled all over his body in search of flesh. They were strong enough to pierce the skin and devour what lay beneath. Even being the main course of that repulsive feast, Xion could not move a single muscle. At that rate, he would be eaten alive. With his vision darkening, he saw his entire life flash before his eyes. What he witnessed on that dark journey through memory ignited something in the depths of his being. Xion recovered a fragment of willpower, fought against the poison, and crushed one of the parasites attempting to snack on his flesh. The movement alerted the ants watching the feast. He laughed at himself for having dared to close his eyes like a coward. Life was far too unfair. The complete flashback of his existence had not shown a single good memory whatsoever. How could he accept dying like a loser? The near-death experience had clearly pushed him beyond his limits. The markings on his forearm increased. Accessing the sand beneath his feet, he eliminated all the surrounding larvae at once with a spiny explosion. The ant army fell into panic. The prisoner, who was supposed to be easy food, was now standing with dozens of compressed missiles floating around him like deadly satellites. Xion looked at his forearm and confirmed it. His rank had increased. The ranking advancement brought poison purification, stamina restoration, and the general increase in mana capacity. The second sandy line on his mark was the concrete proof of the relentless work of the last few days alongside the old man. From brute strength to mana control, everything had leaped to a completely different level compared to his rank F capabilities. And yet, with all the sand missiles at his disposal, he could not cause so much as a scratch on the ant queen. The creature retaliated, attacking with its limbs moving at high speed. A simple strike, but efficient enough to cut through rocks and pulverize them into sand. Xion continued the bombardment, but the queen's shell was simply impenetrable. At that point, he would have been satisfied with just a single dent in that black exoskeleton.
skeleton. The defense was absurd. After a few more wasted attempts, he accepted that the sand missiles would not do the job. No matter how compressed and destructive they were, he needed to rethink the entire strategy from scratch. There had to be a way to break an unbreakable armor. Crushing and piercing were out. Perhaps tearing it off was the way. To try exactly that, Zeon manipulated every grain of sand he could control to completely cover the queen's entire body. He visualized a tight rotational movement in his mind, twisting and peeling the shell from the flesh from the inside out. The queen shrieked in pain. As a retaliation for the brutal attempt to strip her, she began concentrating pure mana in her mandibles. He did not fight against the tearing. Instead, he prepared a devastating counterattack from a distance. Zeon was not the only crazy one in that anthill. The accumulated mana produced ultra-high frequency waves that made his ears bleed. At that rate, his brain could simply explode from the pressure. The direct confrontation had transformed into a battle of endurance and pain tolerance, and Zeon kept betting that his insane plan to strip the queen was the right move. Who would have imagined that the leader of an entire colony would still have an ace up her sleeve, even with blood running from her ears and her own eyes? Zeon accepted the challenge, even knowing there was a real chance he would not make it out of there alive. The rule was simple and brutal. Whoever fell first would lose, and that boy was exactly the kind of person who would rather die alongside the enemy than retreat a single step. The agonizing stalemate reached its limit when Zeon's consciousness began to fragment. Something broke inside, severing the connection between his body and his mind. He had reached the absolute limit. His body simply could no longer keep up with the pace of that insane confrontation, and he was tired of feeling so powerless in the face of it. It was then that Diodin acted. The geyser picked him up from the ground with that same carefree smile as always, scolding the boy for having come so close to death so unnecessarily. Miraculously, Zeon managed to re-establish the connection between mind and body, even joking that he would let the geyser deliver the final blow if he wanted. But none of that was necessary. The Wolf Ant Queen, rank C, was superior to Zeon in practically everything. Even so, he did not yield. He fought to the extent his body allowed, and through persistence and creativity, he earned the right to go on living. Diodane poured praise on him like he had never done since the two had joined together. Too bad that Zeon's eardrums were completely destroyed, because he did not hear a single word. Recognizing the boy's deplorable state, the old man carried his limping body near the queen's corpse. They reached a small clearing where a glowing sphere had been carefully set down. Zeon asked what it was, and Diodin, with no other option given the boy's deafness, began scrawling explanations on the cavern walls. The old man wrote that the sphere was the queen's egg, and that it worked as a kind of medicine with a strawberry flavor. Zeon was confused by the scrawlings, but realized that once again, he was being led to swallow something of completely unknown origin. Remembering the traumatizing episode with the sand angler's gallbladder, he asked, through mime, whether that would also hurt in the same way. Diodin answered honestly that consuming the egg would likely lead to death, but Zeon, still completely deaf, did not catch any of those words. In the end, he chose to trust the old man and brought his mouth close to the glowing egg. He was just a street boy from Neo Seoul. He had never tasted a strawberry in his life, but if strawberries had the same flavor as that, then they must be something truly extraordinary. He even asked for more, as a joke. The smile vanished quickly when something strange began to happen inside him. Blood spines erupted across the entire surface of his body. The bleeding that had stopped came back with full force. Zeon was undergoing the process known as organ inversion, a phenomenon that literally twists and wrings the intestines and neighboring internal structures. Normally, the wolf ant queen's egg is classified as a lethal poison. Even in small amounts, that horrible substance would force the inversion of any human's internal organs, piercing and twisting everything inside as though a thorny stick were being spun through the entrails. Most people simply do not survive the agony and shock caused by this process. With the pain completely clouding his mind, Zeon cursed the old man for having dragged him through hell over and over again. But Diodin had his reasons. He was merely trying to increase the boy's chances of survival in that merciless world by exposing him to a level of suffering capable of breaking the most unshakable of wills. The next phase of the organ inversion was even more brutal. Zeon vomited liters and liters of blood like a shattered faucet. It was a miracle he was still standing. Slowly succumbing to blood loss and collapsing, he began to mentally revisit the last few days. He thought he had finally found someone he could trust, but perhaps Diodin was just another sadist disguised as a guide, and he just another idiot in the old man's hands. While Zeon writhed on the ground in his own pool of blood, Diodin watched without interfering, rummaging through the queen's corpse until he found what he was looking for, a glowing fragment torn from the underside of the beast. The mana stone of a creature of that level was in a completely different category from those mined by hand. It was a grand prize, without a shadow of a doubt. Dio then considered the ant bodies useful for the future and stored them in his independent space. The gesture earned him a scowling look from his sword and crayon. The old man inwardly admitted that perhaps he had gone too far this time, but there was no other way to do it. In that world, those who were weak died. It was the logic of fate. Besides, both he and Crayon knew that the time available to them was not abundant. At dawn, Zeon once again defied the impossible by waking up alive, like a blood-drained baby taking a peaceful nap. The first thing he saw was that irritating smile plastered on the old man's face. On instinct, the boy went after Diodin without thinking twice. The geyser firmly warned him not to start trouble while he was still being nice. Zeon paid no attention. He unleashed a barrage of sand missiles far more powerful than anything he had launched before, aiming directly at the old man. Diodin tried to caution him against impulsivity, but the boy attacked anyway. There was not much to blame. He was on autopilot, convinced that his mentor had tried to kill him on purpose. Zeon's sand buried Diodin deep into the ground. Then he accessed the spiny stalactites hanging from the colony walls, used fine grains to cut one of the giant spikes, and brought everything crashing down on the old man. The combo was devastating, but the cost in mana and stamina was equally high, leaving Zeon completely drained. While the boy raved about an assassination attempt, Diodin simply sighed and seriously questioned the boy's level of intelligence. The geyser had withstood the entire combo without a single scratch, standing in the same spot throughout the entire attack. If he wanted to kill Zeon, all it would take was a flick to the forehead. Why would someone with that kind of power bother poisoning any random worm? The logic was simple, if somewhat insulting. Diodin then explained what really happened. The queen's egg was indeed a poison that twisted and pierced the organs from the inside, but for those who survived the process, it eliminated all the toxins and impurities accumulated in the body. Depending on how it was used, it could be either a lethal poison or a heavenly medicine. After all the internal filth was expelled, mana naturally filled the spaces left behind by the impurities. By the old man's estimate, Zeon's mana tripled or quadrupled.
Upon receiving the full explanation, Zeon apologized effusively, leaped into the geyser's arms, and attributed his behavior to the altered state he had been in. Diodin did not make a big scene, but showed genuine revulsion at being hugged by someone covered in snot. Fortunately, the egg had also healed the boy's injuries. His eardrums were intact again, and he could hear insults once more. Zeon refused to let go of the old man despite the protests. Internally, Diodin and Crayon were discussing the real risks they had taken by letting the boy consume the egg. In truth, Zeon was only partially faking the tearful apology so as not to further irritate his eccentric mentor. Even so, the geyser considered the risk to have been worth it. If the boy did not get strong fast enough, he would be nothing but dead weight. Sometimes reckless bets pay off, and that day was proof of it. Diodin lifted Zeon as though he weighed absolutely nothing. It was time to leave that grim ant colony behind. Zeon was slightly confused to notice the old man was carrying him again since he could now walk perfectly fine. But when Diodin pointed to the spiny ceiling of the cavern, the boy understood he would have no say in the matter. A few moments later, the calm surface of the desert was torn apart by the violent emergence of the two from below. The geyser took charge of the situation with enthusiasm, pressing forward at a reckless pace. Zeon was not exactly a fan of that mode of travel and questioned
questioned why they could not simply travel like normal people. Diodin replied that he might consider the idea if the idiot had not slept for 4 days straight, and that he felt sorry for whoever was going to marry that boy in the future. The banter came to an abrupt halt when the geyser spotted something in the distance. Xian had said that nothing could surprise him anymore, but he promptly shut his mouth when he followed the geyser's gaze. Ahead, there was a massive land turtle, the size of a small island, visible even from nearly 30 kilometers away. Diodin explained that this creature was known as the Archelon, the mobile fortress, a tremendous headache that had never given him a moment of peace. The beast itself was classified as rank B, but its defenses far surpassed most rank A monsters. After being tamed, its shell was modified and turned into a means of transport, a walking fortress. The old man asked the boy to take a good look at the Archelon, for it was exactly before creatures like this that anyone came to realize just how vast and unpredictable the world truly is. There are beings out there capable of taming and riding something of that size, and they're out there, in the wild. When the mobile fortress passed them, both the old man and Xian were no bigger than grains of dust caught between the Archelon's toes. As soon as the turtle stopped, a figure leaped from the shell directly to the ground. By the way Diodin recognized that presence, it was evident the two knew each other. It had been a long time since those two old bags of bones had last met.